Welcome back to the TimCo Retail Manager course. This course focuses on real-world application development. Basically, this is a practice for you doing a job. If you don't know a topic we cover, do some work to get up to speed before taking on the challenge of actually using the topic in this video. This should be mostly practice for what you know already. Otherwise, it can be difficult to get through. In this lesson, we're going to be putting a front end on our user registration system. That means we'll build out a Blazor form for accepting registration information. That will include calling the API, using shared models, and more. Now, for those of you who are subscribed to my Patreon at the $5 per month level or higher, head over to get today's source code for this video. That will give you a good copy to compare your code to in case you run into an issue. Let's jump right into Visual Studio and get started writing our code. So we're going to concentrate mostly today on our web app, the portal. Now, to review where we're at, since you may be jumping into this midstream, and that's totally fine, this is going to simulate a real-world job experience where you don't come in day one and do file new project. You come into an already built piece of source code that you then have to modify, fix, and so on. So let's run this application just to see what's going on and how it operates. So we're going to start off. We have the API starting. We have a WPF application starting, and we also have a Blazor application starting. Now we have the ability to log in to our site here. If we log in with my credentials here, hit log in, it should be that it recognizes who we are and says, hey, welcome Tim, I am Tim Corey. We can verify the authentication, see that in fact we have access to the admin cashier roles, but not the manager role. So we can see all that information based upon our login. If we log out now, we go to verify authentication, and it says, hey, they're not authenticated. So that's what we have so far, but we did create an additional item in our API, which is the ability to register if you're not already registered. But we haven't hooked up the front end for it. That's what we'll do today. So let's close all of this down. A lot to close down now. And we're going to go look at what we need to do. And to do that, we actually need to come to the API and look at, in the controllers, the user controller. And in the user controller, we have a register method, and that allows anonymous, so we can make an anonymous call to it, to register the user. And this takes in a user registration model, which, if we look at that, is actually a record, which is first name, last name, email address, and password. Those are the 4 pieces of data we need to bring in. So we need to call this API using the user controller to register a new user. We need to create a form to fill out the information for a new user, and so on. So the first step that I can think of is we need to figure out how we're going to call the API. Now, we already do that in our WPF application. The desktop UI calls the API all the time. We even have a class library that does all those calls. We have the API and we have the models for talking to the user endpoint, the sales endpoint, the product endpoint, and so on. Well, there's no reason we can't use this library. In fact, if we click here, we'll see that it's a .NET 5 library, which means we can call it from our .NET 5 Blazor WebAssembly project. Now, if we had something that was database specific, we couldn't do this, because if there was database stuff in here, well, then this would get exposed down to the user, and that'd be a bad thing. So we don't have anything database specific. It's all going to call the API endpoint. So therefore, we can just bring this down or connect this to our Blazor WebAssembly project as well. Now, we do have this properties folder here, which has nothing in it. Let's get rid of that item group entry. Let's save that, and that should get rid of that properties. It's kind of just hanging out there. That's kind of like a tiny little bug fix. But let's reference this library. So dependencies on our portal app, add project reference, come down to desktop UI.library. Now, yes, that's now poorly named because it says desktop UI.library when it really is just user interface library. So kind of a bummer there. We can think about if we want to rename that. Renaming can be tricky at best. So we'll have to think through if it's worth it or not. But for now, we're going to hit reference. And that adds a dependency now on the class library. So now both the Blazor WebAssembly portal and the desktop user interface, which is the PF project, both of those refer back to the desktop UI.library project. This is kind of the benefit of bonus, or the reason we have class libraries is to reuse them in more than one spot. Now, one of the things I know that the library needs is in here, it talks to the configuration and reads in the API information. So to do that, it gets the API information right here, which in our desktop UI is in appsettings.json right there. Now, a lot of people are confused right now, or have been confused about this entry. They see that that # curly brace API curly brace #, and they say, Tim, you must have left a bug in there. That's not a bug. That's part of our automated continuous integration and deployment process. The CI/CD process looks at that, says, oh, that's a placeholder, and puts our actual API entry there. And they say, well, but Tim, it doesn't work locally. That's not true if you set up properly for appsettings.development.json, which overrides that setting with the localhost :5001. So you have to have this entry, and you have to make sure that appsettings.development.json is overriding appsettings.json. Then you'll be fine. So with that, though, we need this API entry. Now, if we come up to our www root, and we see appsettings.json, we can see we have an API location, which is the same URL. So if we change this to API, that will work for the class library, but it won't work then for this. So let's do this. Let's look for Control F. We're gonna look in the current project for API location, and we're gonna find all the places it's referenced, which would be right here. We're gonna say API, and do it again. No more occurrences. So now we can just rename this to be API, and now it will be useful for both the current project, the Blazor WebAssembly project, and for the class library, since it's referring to the same location. So that was just kind of a naming issue we had there. We had to fix. All right, so now let's talk about bringing in those class library items. And the way we do that is through dependency injection. Let's close out of all these. So dependency injection is in program.cs inside the portal. So inside there, we have right in here is our dependency injection setup already. Now we need to bring in additional items. And we do have a model for how to use these items. We go to bootstrapper.cs in the TRM desktop UI project. We will see that we bring in our dependencies right down here in the configure method. We have two different sections, one for per request, which would be transients, and one for singletons. So we can basically replicate this entry and these entries in our program.cs. Now, this is the way to do it when you have a few dependencies. But once you get so that your dependency list grows a little larger, then what we're going to do is, and we'll probably do this at some point, is we're going to have a method in our class library that says, here's all the dependencies that you're going to find inside of me. And that's going to just bring in all of those with one entry. Notice up here, things like add Blazor local storage or add authorization core. These methods bring in multiple dependencies with one method. It's, I think, ideal to do that in our class library as well. That way we don't have to keep saying, oh, what do we refer to? How do we, which type do we use, and so on. So I'm going to put them in manually for now, but note that I think I'm going to change this over to instead use a more intelligent approach, a more dry approach, so that we can do it once and then use it everywhere. Which also means that I will probably be redoing the dependency injection inside of our WPF project, possibly, to use the Microsoft dependency injection instead of the simple dependency injection system that comes with Caliburn Micro. But for now, let's register our types. Let's start with a singleton, which is Iapi Helper. So I'm going to say builder.services. I'm keeping these grouped together on their own. Add singleton. And we're going to say Iapi Helper. And that's going to add that using statement right here for the TRM desktop UI.library.api. So we're going to say API helper. And then we're also going to add in these three right here, which are product endpoint, user endpoint, and sales endpoint. So builder.services.add transient, product endpoint. Oops. And then builder.services.add transient, user endpoint. And the last one was sales. Sales or sale endpoint. Okay, so we have product, user, and sale. And that is product, user, and sale. So we brought in all of those dependencies. You may ask, what about these dependencies? Well, window manager, event aggregator, and these two, the first two, are for the Caliburn microsystem. Now, the logged in user model, yep, we need to bring that in too. So let's grab that. I'll put up here the other singleton. Build.services.add singleton, and that's the logged in user model and logged in user model, like so. So now we have the dependencies brought into our Blazor WebAssembly project. And that's kind of the beauty of dependency injection. We can now just start asking for these because they're in our DI system. Now we can start thinking about how to work with our data. And to do that, we actually go to the class library. So let's collapse down our UI project and go to the class library, and in models, let's start there. And let's add or make sure we don't have one. We have a user model, but that has just ID, name, roles, and role list. That's not what we're looking for. We want instead kind of a created user ID or something like that. Let's call this, so create user model. How about that? This is for creating users. So we make it public. And in here, we're going to add a few properties. Prop, string, first name. Prop, that's a snippet, so prop, tab twice. String, last name. Prop, string, email address. Prop, string, password. And prop, string, confirm password. Because we're actually going to ask the password twice to make sure you give us one that's the same. That way you didn't mistype it accidentally and didn't know that. Now, we need to make this model also check the data that's being entered. So we're going to say required, and that brings in system.componentModel.data annotation, the using statement for that up at the top. And then we'll do the same for last name. Last name is required. All these are required actually. So let's do this. Let's just copy this and we'll paste it in. Got a little too aggressive with my copying there. Paste it in there, and paste it in there. So now all 5 are required. That's not quite good enough yet. I also want to validate that this is in fact an email address. And that's going to say, hey, you know what? Not only is it required, we also want a valid format for an email address. So first part, the @ symbol, next part. That's pretty much what it does to validate email addresses, because there's so many different domain types that it could be legitimate to have .co instead of .com, or it could be legitimate to have something even different than that. So there's a lot of permutations for a email address, but at least it's going to give us a rough check on it. Now, we also want, this is the password. We also make sure that this password here, the confirm password, matches this password. So let's say compare, and we're going to compare to, and it says string other property. And we could put in here password, and that's what you're going to see some demos do. But now we have a new feature, which is name of password. And the difference there is what's going to happen is it's going to take this password field. It's going to use that string. It's essentially just going to wrap this in quotes. But the benefit of saying name of and this is the fact that if I were to refactor this, let's say I would change this to password1, and I did control dot rename password to password1. Notice it renames it down here. If I were to change it back to password and I were to leave it alone like so, now I get an error statement here saying, hey, I can't find password1. So if instead of doing this, we used a string like so, first always say password1 and do the rename, it does not change this. And also notice there's no red squigglies now under this because it doesn't know that there's any difference. It just knows that's a string, and it can take any string you want. So we need to make sure that it's using name of, so that we have that assurance that in fact it's going to do some design time checking of that data. So that's the first thing. And then we'll also have an error message, and we'll say the error message equals the passwords do not match. Okay, now we could put some information in here as well for the required. For instance, we can come up to, let's just say first name. We could say error message equals, and then put our message here. So it'd say something, instead of just saying field first name, it would say, you know, whatever you want, like the first name is required instead, with spaces in between and make it look nice. But we're gonna leave this alone. I don't think we need to do all that typing, but this at least gives you a good idea of the validation and comparison you can do. Now also note that for this password, I would probably put a regular expression evaluator on here to say, hey, here's what we want this password to be. It needs to be at least 8 characters. It needs to have an uppercase, a lowercase, a number, or a special character. And I would put a regular expression validator on there to make sure that that field meets the requirements. Not both fields, just the password. Because the confirmed password has to match the password. Therefore, it will match that validation if the password passes the validation. So we could do that. I'm not going to get into that because I haven't really covered regular expressions too much. I am going to cover them at some point with at least one video. They're pretty complicated in some ways, but at the same time, really powerful. So they really require quite a bit of discussion around how to work with them effectively. But I'm not going to do that at this point because of the complexities that brings in. Okay, so that's our model. That gets us what we need. Let's go ahead and copy this. And now that we have that, I am going to come down to our API helper. So the library API folder, user endpoint. And in here, after get all, it doesn't matter where you put it, but I'm going to put it after get all. I'm going to create a new method, public async. It's going to get an asynchronous call. We're calling it API. Should always be async. Task, create user. Create user model. and we'll call it model. Okay, now this method is what we're going to call from our Blazor WebAssembly project. We're going to pass in the create user model data model, which is going to have first name, last name, email address, password, and confirm password, what we just created. And this is going to actually call the API and create the user and make sure that the user creates successfully. We're not returning any data here. This is a, it depends kind of thing, but we're kind of following in the footsteps of what we do in other places where add user to role. We just say task. And if there's a problem, we throw an exception and give the reason. Now, so far, our API is not returning great messages. We need to address that. But for now, I think still we're going to follow this pattern of not having a return value, but instead throw an exception. Throwing exceptions can be a lot better in some ways than having a return value. If the create user should work, then you shouldn't just say, oh no, it didn't work. You need to say, no, stop. It didn't work. There's a problem. Because otherwise, the user may expect something that hasn't happened. Your application may be in a state that is unexpected, and that can cause problems. So let's make sure we throw an exception here. So first of all, I need to set up a model to send to our API. But our API, if you remember, does not take a confirmed password. So I'm going to say var data equals new. I'm just going to put a new anonymous object. I'm going to say model.firstname, model.lastname, model.email address, and model.password, because those are the names of the fields it needs and the names of my model object. So if your model property matches the property you're assigning it to, you don't need to say property name equals. So I could be saying first name equals like this, but this is kind of redundant because it's already going to assign it by default a property name of first name. Therefore, that's fine. Now let's also wrap this. Come on, wrap on me. Well, it's not going to do it by default, so I'm going to, or I don't have the right key command to do so, so I'm just going to do it manually. There we go. So there is our new object that we're creating. Now we're going to actually call our API. So using, and in fact, we can actually just copy one of these. So let's just copy this one right here because it really is the same call. So using API client post as JSON async, that's exactly what we want to do. But instead of users/admin/add role, we're going to say API/user/register. Pass the data in. And if the status code is false, then yes, we're going to throw an exception. So really that code is all the same. In fact, let's unpin this so you can see the whole code. We have a using statement that is going to call and await our API post as JSON async, the register method passing in our data. And if the success code is not successful, then say, okay, throw in a new exception and pass the reason phrase. That's the part we need to make a little better in the future so that the API returns real reasons instead of just saying bad request, which is what we don't want. Okay, but for now, we're going to leave it alone. We're going to address that in its own video. So now we have a create user method that should do everything we need it to do. But this is not part of the interface of this class. We have the iUser endpoint. It's not in there. So we can say when we select the create user, we can say control dot and say pull create user up to iUser endpoint. And that's going to add this entry right here, this green section, to our interface. Click that, and now it's in the interface. So now you can call this when we ask for the iUser endpoint. That's pretty much all we need to do, I believe, in our class library. So let's collapse that down, go back to our portal. We can go back to our pages. And in here, we need to create a new page. Let's create a register page. So raise your component. And let's call this register. And in here, we'll need to do some housekeeping. First of all, at page equals, or at page, no equals, just page quotes / register. And that's going to allow us to navigate to this page when we say our URL / register. And then we need a couple of injections here, which is going to call from the dependency injection system. First of all is that iUser endpoint, but we don't have that in our imports. So in the imports, we're going to say at using, and we'll say trm desktop UI.library.api. And that will make it easier for us in our inject statement here to just say iUser endpoint, and let's call it user endpoint. Now you also need to inject, well, let's stop there for now. Let's just do this. Now let's modify our H3 to say create an account. And we need to start building out our form. But to do that, we need to have a model. So let's create our model. But again, we have to add a statement in the import statement. So at using trm desktop UI.library.models. We're going to use one of the models from the shared models folder. And we're going to say create user model. We'll call it model equals new, like so. This is the new syntax. We don't have to re-specify create user model a second time. That's part of C#9. So now that we have a model, we can come back up here to create our edit form. So let's say edit form. We're going to say model equals at model. And then we're going to say on valid submit equals at on valid submit, which we don't have created yet. That's okay. And there's our edit form. And our model is working now. Good. So an on valid submit, let's just create that private async task on valid submit, like so. And then control KD to format that properly. So now we have our edit form. We put some data or some fields into it. So let's do this, basically the same thing we did previously on the login form before we changed it to be inline. So let's start with data annotation validator. It's going to validate our data annotations, make sure that if we say required, that it's actually checked to be sure it's required, or that's actually filled out, and so forth. Then we're going to say div class equals form group and also row class. And then we're going to say label for equals first name and class equals call-md-2 and call-form-label. And we'll call this first name, like so. And then we'll have a second entry down here, which is actually a div class equals call-md-12, or I'm sorry, 10. If you're not familiar with these classes, this is Bootstrap, specifically Bootstrap 4. Bootstrap 5 just came out. I'm still looking over to see what all the things that have changed and so on are. But Bootstrap 4 is what .NET Core uses currently. And it's a really powerful way of laying things out simply without having to write a lot of CSS yourself. It's pretty lightweight as well. So there's a lot of benefits in using it, but these are from that. Now, I'll probably do at some point a Bootstrap 5 course. I may dip down to 4 as well. We'll see. But in the meantime, just go to getbootstrap.com and look at their docs. They're excellent. Just make sure you're looking at the docs for the right version that you're using. This is version 4. The versions are going to have minor and revision versions. So I think 4.6.3 maybe is the current one for the 4 series. But the minor and revisions don't really matter as much as the major version does. So make sure it's the version 4. All right. Input text ID equals first name. And class equals form control. And at bind value is going to equal model.firstname. And I'm going to put the validation message right here. Validation message. And for equals at open paren, close paren, arrow, model.first name, like so. And then you have to close out like so. So this is going to look at the validation and if there's a problem with the first name field. So if the first name field is a problem, the message for that problem will be right below the input text. So that way you always see the message right below the box where you're trying to enter data. That's going to be the kind of pattern for each of our fields. So let's just copy and paste to save us a lot of time. We need to make sure we change all the values. So last name. This is last name. So yeah, a lot of changes there. But if you get them all, excellent. If you don't, you're going to find out about it hopefully sooner rather than later, but you'll find out about it and have a problem. So email address, email address, and this is just email, like so. So those first 3, pretty simple. They're just text boxes. The email address is going to have that validation for email. It's going to take care of everything. Next up, we have our password. So let's call this password, which means this gets called password. And this is password. And this is password. But we don't want the password to be in plain text. So what we want to do is we want to say that the input text, the type equals password. That way we're going to limit it to not showing the password. It's going to show us the dots instead when we type it out. Now let's copy this one and paste it in for our confirm password. So we'll say confirm password. And we'll call this confirm password, like so. Confirm password. Type is password, not confirm password. But the ID is confirm password. The bind value is confirm password. Validation message is confirm password. Yep, I think that's it. So now down here, we have a div, the class equal to row. And yes, we're kind of redoing this, but it's a little different. Div class equals call-md-12, as in a full span. And text right, like so. And Then we're going to say in here, a button type equals submit, and class equals btn, btn-success, and create account with a name. So it's going to be the create account button. Okay, so that's our form. Our form is complete. Now, when they fill it out, it's going to populate this model, and only when they submit a valid model will this get called, which is where we're going to do our work. Now, I need one more thing up here. I'm going to have a string error message entry. That way, when I do my try catch, so I'm going to say, well, first of all, let's set error message equal to empty string at the very beginning. That way, if we're trying it a second time, it'll clear out the error message while we're trying it. And we're going to say try. That creates our catch. It's a catch exception. I'm going to get rid of the throw. And if there's an error or exception, I'm going to say error message equals ex.message, which for right now we'll say bad request. But again, we're going to work on fixing that in the future. So here's the fun part. We're going to await user endpoint dot create user, passing in the model. That's it. That will create our user. Now, what we want to happen after we create the user though, because that's going to create the user, but it's going to stay on the same page. The field's going to be filled out. It's not really very informative to the user that yes, it did work. So let's do something with this created user. Now, if you just create an account, my thought is that the first thing that should happen is that you're automatically logged in. We already know you're using a password. So let's do that. And I already know where there's a call to do that, and that is in the login page. So right down here, we have this call right here. I'm going to copy this, and I come back over here, and after the await user endpoint create user, I'm going to paste it in. Now, we're going to break some stuff because we don't have this model. We don't have the auth service, and we don't have the nav manager. So let's bring in the auth service and nav manager first. So we go to the top, we say inject, we're going to say authentication service. We'll call this auth service to match. And also the navigation manager, call it nav manager to match. And now I come down here and we'll see that these should clear up. That one did. That one did as well, but we're still having a problem with model. But I know that model is pretty simple. In fact, let's go over here and look at the model, which is an authentication user model. I hit F12 to go to it, and it's asking for an email address and a password. So we can provide that without having to create our own fancy model. To do that, we're just going to say new, and it's going to ask for an email address equals model.email address. And it's a bit confused here, I think, because it thinks that model is what we were asking for before. So no worries, we're just going to say email address and password equals model.password. And we'll close our curly braces, and hopefully that should kind of sort itself out once it figures out that model that we're referring to is right up here. Well, here's the problem. I'm in the wrong form. That's the problem. No wonder I had a problem, right? Well, that's the code I want. I'm going to copy that out so I have it. But then what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you a quick tip for working with Git. I can right click on login.razor. I can say Git. I can say undo changes. Be very careful of this because if you do it in the wrong file that you had changes in you wanted, it's too late, it's gone. But undo changes. Are you sure? Yep. And now the login page is reset. It's using login or model again. Now you can come over here to this model and paste that in, and that should work just fine because That's the model we're looking for that says model. So now we're going to log in that user, right? Get the results. If the results are not null, then we're going to navigate to the main page. Perfect. And if they have a problem, then we have this text, this error text. Well, we can just grab this error text right here. We can get rid of this statement right here. We can say the registration worked, but there was an error when trying to log in. So the registration did work, because if we got to this part right here, then we've already successfully passed the create user stage. So that did work. If it didn't work, we would have gone to the catch and worked with our error. So the registration worked, but there's an error trying to log in. Now, that should never happen, but in case it does, this is what we get. So now we just need a way to go to this page, and we can do this in a number of different ways, but I think the way I want to tackle it is if we look at the shared page, I believe it's the main layout where we have our login page. Yep, it's right here. It says not authorized, log in. Well, we can modify that. The login page is right here. We can add a new button. So we have a button right here that's submit that is log in. Well, we can put another button next to it that doesn't have any kind of action on the form itself. In fact, let's put it inside of here. So we're gonna put another button. We're not gonna call it submit. We're gonna call it our type button. And this is gonna be, instead of success, let's do primary, like so. And we're gonna say that the button or name is register. And we're gonna have to have an on click for this. And let's give us a method name. Let's call this register user. And we'll have a private void register user, like so. Control KD to format that again. And we're just gonna have the navigate right up here to register. So in theory that works. Let's give this a shot. So we know you can go to /register and it should work, but hopefully this button will give us what we want as well. So we can just click on a register button to register into the system. Now, unlike the loading form or the login form, we don't just do the action right here. We actually navigate to a different page. So we hit register. That brings us to create an account. Well, let's create an account for, I have some pre-filled, I think from, I'm not sure, but Bob at smithy.com. We don't have a Bob Smith in the system yet. So let's put a bad password match. So first let's hit create account, no passwords. And no, password field is required, confirm password field is required. Notice there's no space here between confirm and password. That's because I didn't give it a custom name. It just uses the property name. Now, if we wanted to, we could say that the display name for confirm password is confirm space password, and that would at least address that. But, well, that might be something good to do. We'll probably add that in just a minute. But for now, let's add a password and a second password. Notice the lengths do not match. And it says the passwords do not match. So I hit tab off it, and now it's already validated without even hitting submit. So it's doing some client-side validation. I hit create account. It's gonna take a bit to run. And then once it does, in theory, as long as it worked, it's going to navigate us to the home page. Now, so far it hasn't. which is interesting. Let's hit F12, make sure there's no errors. Well, there is this failed to load resource on the register. Interesting. So there's something going on. We didn't even get that error. Well, that's because we haven't put the error system in place either. So let's figure that out. Let's go back, close all this out, and let's figure out how to see that error. Let's go to the register page, not the login page. And in here, we have the error message, but we're never actually showing it anywhere up here. So let's do that. Let's say right below our H3, we're gonna say @if string.is null or white space on our error message field equals false. I get this question a lot. I'm gonna answer it again. And the question, or the Control KD, by the way. The question is, why don't you just put the exclamation point in front of the string.is null or white space instead of the equals false? And the answer is that readability. So this is very explicit and clear, whereas the other one can get lost in the shuffle, and you may think that it's only running this if it's null or white space, not if it's not null or white space. So this is clear. So only difference, as far as the compiler goes, it's the same. It's not going to be any faster or more performant. It's not gonna make for a smaller file size, nothing. It's only for readability. So in here, we're gonna say div class equals alert and alert danger. And the role equals alert. And at error message. That's gonna display our error message for us whenever it's not empty. Now it's also, while we're here, let's go back to our class library into our models, in our create user model, and we'll change let's change anywhere it has a compound name like this. Display name, and that's going to be first name, and no, not string. There we go, like that. And then last name as well. Email address, the display name will be email address. Password's fine, but this one is going to be confirm password. That way they're at least displayed nicer when we show those error messages. Okay, so let's also check to see if Bob was already in the database. That might be our problem as well. So let's go to API auth database, go to the users, go to view data. And yes, there is a Bob entry here. May have come from my testing, may have come from just now, I'm not sure. Either way, let's delete it. But don't forget, we're also creating, oops, not Cloud Object Explorer. I want the SQL Server Object Explorer. I also want to go to TRM data, tables, and users, because there'll be an entry for Bob there as well that I need to delete. We have an entry in both tables. That way we don't kind of cross our information between authentication and our regular data. We have two different databases, but we have an entry for Bob in both. So let's start this again. If we get an error, we will see it on the page. And if we don't get an error, then we will see it actually work. So register Bob Smith, bob@smithy.com. Create account, let it run. And not only to go back to the main page, it says, welcome bob@smithy.com. And if we go to verify authentication, Bob's authenticated, but no access, no roles available to Bob. Okay, so that worked. If we try and register Bob again, So let's register Bob again. Password's not as important. It's going to say bad request. And that's probably what we're getting previously, but that's because Bob already exists in the database. So that's when we log in as Bob instead and say log in. Now we're logged in as Bob. So that's the registration form. It works. Again, we have to make those API responses a whole lot better, so they're more clear as to you entered a bad password or the account already exists, things like that, so we can be a little more clear to the users why it failed, not just that it failed. Otherwise, I think that we are good with our system. It's running the way we expect it to. Now we can start tackling also the idea of seeing the user information. So seeing the items you can put in the shopping cart, and whether or not we allow the users to make a purchase or not, we can talk about that. We can think that one through, but we should at least be able to, go through the checkout process as a user on the server. I would think on the Blazor WebAssembly app, but then also we need the admin side of things where the administrators can add items to the inventory. They can look at the reports and so on. So those are things coming up. And this has all been kind of set up for that. And I think we're now at the point where we can start moving ahead with creating some of that content and getting, making use of our roles and saying, okay, this person does not even have access to see this entry, but otherwise, an admin can get in and add new products, stuff like that. So we're getting to the kind of the fun part of now that we're authenticated, we can start using that authentication and put some data on the web. All right, so that's all for this lesson. If you have questions, if you have comments, if you spot bugs, let me know down in the comments below. I love your feedback. I appreciate it, and I incorporate it into what I do going forward. All right, thanks for watching. And as always, I am Tim Corey.